RevOps, is really around increasing revenue, reducing friction, all the way up to the customer lifecycle, and that's generally comes into play when you have a lot of technology involved. If you don't have a lot of technology and you're in person, you may not have a dedicated RevOps person, at least in the way that we think about it. But distributed teams that are operating with heavy tech stacks, that's where you're going to start feeling a lot of gridlock within the company. And then you find people focused on reducing that gridlock and improving the customer journey and the sales rep journey.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the RevAmp Podcast. I am your host, Mark Lerner, Director of Growth Marketing here at Deal Hub. Really excited to have today's guest with us, Brantley Pace. We're going to dive into all sorts of topics around RevOps and his kind of unique experiences there. But before we jump into all of those fun topics, Brantley, why don't you tell the folks at home a little bit about yourself and your journey?
Certainly. Thanks, Mark, for having me. I'm Brantley Pace, and I've been in SaaS for about 10 years now. Most recently as a VP of Revenue Operations and a VP of Go-to-Market, and so for a growing SaaS company. So I've had the good fortune of experiencing sales and operations in SaaS from pre-seed to Series D, through 6 M&As, 3 unicorns, from $1 million in ARR up to $100 million in ARR. And so I've kind of seen every stage of the growth and how things develop. And I'm excited for what's to come for SaaS and for RevOps. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's unique, right? Because you've had that experience, such a breadth, right? Like, someone that is at a much smaller startup, to be able to be at that level at a company that gets acquired, let alone several. And now you're kind of back doing kind of the founder thing, which we can talk about a little bit as well, if you'd like. That gives you this unique view on the space. So one of the things that I always like diving into with my guests is their view on how this world of revenue operations, go-to-market, how it's changed over the last, let's say, 5 years. There's been a lot of kind of, let's say, macro headwinds that have affected everybody. But I'm interested from your view, especially since you've had this breadth of experience, how things have shifted, the way way things look today as compared to before.
I think one of the things that's shifting is more and more companies are adopting technology-first strategies outside of SaaS. That's something that I'm seeing a lot of, which is a good thing for revenue operations, because RevOps is really around increasing revenue, reducing friction, all the way up to the customer lifecycle, and that's generally comes into play when you have a lot of technology involved. If you don't have a lot of technology and you're in person, you may not have a dedicated RevOps person, at least in the way that we think about it. But distributed teams that are operating with heavy tech stacks, that's where you're going to start feeling a lot of gridlock within the company. And then you find people focused on reducing that gridlock and improving the customer journey and the sales rep journey, all the way from the very beginning of awareness to the point of renewals and expansion. So that model, I'm seeing more and more of it play out beyond SaaS and tech. So that's where I see a lot of RevOps expanding into, beyond just the world of SaaS, which is where generally I see 90% of people operating in. That's where I see a lot of people thinking about some of the strategies that are working, is they're selling B2B strictly to tech. And those strategies have some relation to expansion beyond that, but not entirely. And that's, to me, is exciting to see what happens. RevOps takes some of its learnings and applies it to not necessarily tech environments.
Yeah, that's interesting. So do you think that's a function of maybe some of these, reductions in force that happened across companies and a look to become more efficient and more scalable? So instead of having, bodies to actually manually do some of this stuff, looking to automate it so that they can scale without increasing their costs?
I think so. I think that's the common denominator across RevOps expanding beyond tech. And even within tech, it's this question of how do we become more efficient with what we have? Right. And that's just a root question and a root condition that RevOps always operates with. And so for a while, some people didn't have to really know the nuance of the business. They didn't have to understand the details of the tech. It didn't need to be efficient. They could just add headcount, and they didn't really get pressure to be ultra efficient. In fact, it was considered a negative, particularly for venture-backed companies, to be efficient in profitability at the expense of growth. That was you didn't do that. And some companies who are still growing at that level still can't do that. That's not the expectation. So in that side, RevOps has to focus on the growth variable. But 9 out of 10 companies aren't actually at that level and don't need to be. And so they have to focus on profitability and efficiency in other areas of the business. Both of those are core functions of RevOps. And because different companies are getting that same pressure either to grow more efficiently or to be more efficiently profitable, all that comes down to, like, that's what RevOps does at any company. And more people are saying, how do we do that better? There's different teams that you can call that. Sometimes you're hearing GTM ops, RevOps, sales ops, marketing ops, like you name it. There's some team that's focused on those core questions.
Yeah, and this term GTM ops is actually one I'm hearing more and more. So I'm interested, from where you stand, how does that? Is it just a different name for the same thing, or does it imply different responsibilities or slightly different tactics? What's the difference there?
It's always going to depend on my company. I think some places GTM ops and RevOps are going to do the same thing. In some companies, they've intentionally made that decision because they want it to focus differently. What you're generally going to see is if it's GTM ops, it's going to align around a revenue organization that thinks of themselves as GTM. They've aligned the org structure of the company as GTM. For instance, when I was VP GTM, we own the entire go-to-market org, and we thought about it differently than just sales or revenue. In that environment, it helps to have an ops team aligned to that same org structure, that same vision of the company. So I don't think there's that much difference between GTM ops and RevOps in general. I think you're going to find GTM ops being more focused on demand generation, top of the funnel, and you're going to see RevOps maybe be a little more sales ops focused. I would say that's in generality, but they're both very similar. If you had a Venn diagram, there'd be really small overlap, whereas other ops teams have very distinct differences between RevOps, sales ops, marketing ops, CX ops. I do think those have very different approaches, but GTM ops and RevOps, I think, is more of a naming play to refocus RevOps on actually generating demand, whereas sometimes they can fall back to being analysts, report generators, tool admins, and really they're too much of an operations focus and not enough of revenue. So I think GTM helps those same teams refocus on the go-to-market element of operations.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because it's only in the last year or two that it's a title that I've come across more and more often, and I wonder if that's a reflection of the market somehow, and kind of maybe somehow reading the tea leaves as to the direction we're going. But from you'd mentioned kind of the core responsibility of RevOps or GTM ops or whatever it is, amongst other things, was kind of reducing friction. And you've had this kind of wide breadth of experience across companies of different sizes, different stages. But for the revenue operator watching or listening at home, maybe we can jump into some of the areas in which friction exists and how it can potentially be reduced by someone in a RevOps role.
Sure. Friction, it's kind of often the opposite too. You always want to think about, are you applying friction or are you reducing friction? Because there are times you want to apply friction. And there's a lot of RevOps frameworks that actually kind of teach that and train to that. And I think that's a good way to always think about it, which is there are times you want to apply friction, the times you want to remove friction. So some of the ways that you want to remove friction is generally when you want to go faster. And that in most cases, you can identify in your sales cycle where are the big steps happening, right? And so if you just think from the very big top of the funnel, when people are trying to engage with your brand, what are the frictions that it takes for them to talk to somebody? How easy is it to get information, to schedule meetings, to get demos of your product? And so thinking through those steps and collapsing that stack and those steps to make it easier and faster, do those things to make it easy to buy. That's sometimes for most companies. There may be some cases where you just don't do that and you're trying to add friction. Maybe you're an enterprise company and your ACV is over $100,000 and you just don't want everybody clicking on the scheduling demo when you know for a fact that you're just selling to a specific type of company. But most companies, that's just not the case. So you're always looking for ways to make it faster and easier to talk to a rep. Once your reps get engaged with the product or with the customer, all those different types of steps that they're doing, from engaging with emails and calls, creating proposals, even things like quoting calculators, right? That's a great way to, if you're on a call and they're trying to get a quote, you don't necessarily need the entire quote build, which is generally where CPQ like deal hubs come in, right? But having a quote calculator that's just in a Google Sheet is a great way to quickly get a number, but doesn't generate any type of deliverable, but allows you to have quicker conversations so that you can go into something like Deal Hub to create the type of quote that you're looking for. A Deal Hub, I think, is actually a great example of reducing friction. One of the ways that we deployed Deal Hub is that we wanted to create fast links for deals. And so we didn't want everybody to have to go up and ask for approval. So the pre-approval framework allowed us to create a network of pre-approved items that we could go to those stakeholders and say, great, for command and control and for quality control, these are things you want to happen. We can automatically pre-approve them and under certain conditions, and we can flag to you when they go above that. That reduces friction for certain types of deals and it increases friction for other ones. So like, hey, we want this to happen, but we need to have a conversation. Well, that's a friction point. It's a good friction point from the perspective of quality control. Those types of things exist. There's so many places throughout the revenue. There's really it's hard to imagine the amount of work it takes to go through those steps. And you have to, that's why I think RevOps has value. You have to have the full picture to be able to think through all the steps, not just your siloed view of it.
Yeah. That's a really great insight. And looking at it from, introducing friction as actually being a positive in some cases, it's super interesting because I rarely think about it, but it's obvious when I do, because, for example, the opposite of what you were mentioning, whereas, if you set limits to certain aspects of a deal in order to require approvals, manual approval, that's adding friction, right? You're stopping somebody from, just going ahead. You adding those guardrails. But switching gears a little bit, you talked a little bit about RevOps and its role in demand generation. And it's not a topic we often cover here. So I'd love to kind of get your insight on that and where RevOps fits in the future of demand generation.
Yeah, so when RevOps, the last few years, kind of, at least from the world I experienced it in, there's so much focus on growth. Your job was to help grow the company as quickly as possible. Then there was, in general, the meta conversation around efficiency and making sure companies were generally profitable. And so you're not necessarily focused on growth at all costs. You're basically saying, how do we make the existing customer base grow? How do we help the existing team be more efficient? Like, you're looking through efficiency through the same variables. Now there's a lot more around, hey, we've got to grow still as companies. And a lot of companies are struggling with that. They're using and leveraging technologies that they don't know how to use. And that I'm seeing a lot more conversations with companies around email deliverability issues, right? There's obviously lots of conversations going on around the outreach sales law Apollo strategy that a lot of companies built their sales team on. It was hire 10 SDRs, give them 10 seats to that, and then grow. And when there was, I think, lower thresholds to buy and a high desire to buy point solutions, people did that. And now there's a reduction in those needs, and they've only increased that leverage because it was like, well, this is the leverage we know how to do. Headcount, volume, push harder on that lever, and that's just plummeted demand gen. And so revenue operations has a role to play and to think through how new solutions are being adopted for that company. And that's how RevOps can elevate their own careers, is being part of those conversations, as opposed to just being reactionary and saying, well, if you buy the tool, I'll own it. Well, that's just a tool admin. You're kind of an IT-focused GTM person. well, I'm just going to report on it. Well, now you're just a data analyst focused on revenue, right? For me, RevOps is just more than tool admin and more than in data analysis. It's being part of that 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 revenue conversation and thinking through how the tools, systems, and processes come together to generate new demand. And there's a lot of opportunity for thought leaders to think through those types of strategies that are working, that aren't working. It's really an exciting pivot point because the companies that can't adapt won't. And they're going to be replaced by companies that can. And that was a key element of early SaaS growth in the 2000s that separated the winners from the losers. And there's a lot of companies that got funding in the last 2 or 3 years that you can't buy innovation. You can't really buy the growth anymore. So what do? You got to have the right talent, have asking the right questions, come up with the right processes. And there's so many new tools coming out. It's gonna come into RevOps to figure out how you leverage new technology and emerging technology to generate demand.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's so many things there that you articulated so much of my thoughts that I haven't quite been able to articulate. But this idea that people that were focused on these just like as much outreach as you can do via email, like account-based marketing, direct email outreach, you just increase the volume and there's you'll get more sales, and that seems to not be working as it once did. I actually wonder if part of that is that it's just gotten so noisy in those areas, in my mailbox and others, that people are not paying attention anymore. And I actually feel like one of the reasons for that is the ubiquity and ease of use, or how easy it is to poorly use things like AI for that. Anyone can kind of create these custom at scale emails that are different for each person, but if you can do it very poorly. So that kind of leads to the next thing. We wouldn't be really a podcast if we didn't cover the AI thing. So, I have yet to really see AI, a use case for AI that's kind of been accepted in RevOps specifically. I think there are many, but I don't see it really being adopted very much. So where do you see AI fitting into the RevOps tech stack and strategy?
It's going to be, I'm very bullish on AI. I'm excited for what's going to be developed for it. I think it's going to look like this. They're going to take a hit and then it's going to evolve and mature into really useful tools. I'll give you an example. So my company's name is ForgeWorks. There's not a lot of information on it. It's a new company. I get daily AI generated emails where the personalization is conflating me with a blacksmith and software. I'm not kidding. I could screen share and show you where clearly AI written. In fact, they're proud of it because in the bottom it will say generated by AI agent, and it'll list the company that generated it. But in the very beginning, in the very, everybody loves to personalize that front part. And that's kind of what AI's pitch is. We can aggregate 50 different data sources and personalize it. Well, people aren't paying attention to what they're sending out. And it's doing a little bit of a brand harm because immediately after telling me that they can help me grow my tech company, but they also love the blog, I'm not kidding, about the bronze axes that we made. I'm like, wrong ForgeWorks, man. Like that is, and then no one's paying attention to it. And so I think what people are seeing in AI is they're just going to burn through what little credibility they had when it comes to AI generated text, which is 90% of what people are using AI today for in mass adoption is AI generated text. And that's cool. It reduces some friction, but it's not critical, I don't think, in most use cases. But that's how it's like, we're doing AI outbound. It's like what you're doing is you're just going faster on the solutions that don't work. It means you're just massing emails because you're not calling all those people, right? And you're using AI to generate it that sometimes is accurate and they just nail it, but it's a little bit of a selective bias because they don't ever share the screenshots of the ones I get. They'll share like, this is amazingly done. Like, okay, how many millions of emails did you send? I'm not even kidding. I've had conversations with people sending millions of these emails. To generate the ones that was like, that was perfect. I had no idea it was AI. But then all the people like me who get them who AI doesn't know. The AI is only looking and aggregating ForgeWorks domains and doesn't know that, or somehow is combining different companies to get it wrong, right? So that's kind of the negative side of it, is that there are generating some demand, but then they're destroying the deliverability rate, they're destroying the open rates, and I don't know if this is really going to scale. So that's how RevOps today is using it, is generally through generative text. I'm really excited about how AI models can help with data analysis and how it can help with a lot of what RevOps busy work is. That's what we're focused on at ForgeWorks. There's a lot of things that RevOps does today that's manual, that's just stuck in the CRM that no one wants to go out and do and dig for. And so there's a lot of tools that were never built for RevOps. They're built to do a function in sales that RevOps now owns. That's very different than a tool built for RevOps. And that's functionally what ForgeWorks is focusing on, is building a platform for RevOps to do 80% of the work that they're doing manual today. And it leverages and works with some of these other bigger point solutions that, again, sell to RevOps, but aren't specifically RevOps tools. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of RevOps people that will have millions of dollars in software and still work 80 hours a week. Mm-hmm. And that was my genesis. I was like, hang on a second, how do I have a whole team of RevOps people? I'm working 80 hours a week. I can literally buy whatever software I want. And it's because it wasn't just the tools were consolidated, right? There's a lot of tools consolidating, and that's kind of good for both the users and the tools, is they can expand their user base. Their users have less tools. But there's also a core amount of RevOps functions that are still very manual today. That manual work is very focused on data still. That stuff is just not available today to RevOps. So when you're using some AI models to be able to look at data, present insights, that's something that I think RevOps is going to see more of in the coming years. That's different than generative text.
Yeah, I actually agree. As a marketer, when I saw the first iteration of ChatGPT, I think, like most marketers, I had, my eyes lit up, because I was like, oh, this can generate endless content. And, what I found, and I think what most people have found, is that if you are interacting with the model, the outcomes can be very good. But if you just set it on its own without the kind of rules, and even with rules, but there are hallucinations, it is not there yet. And what I found doing some of the kind of operational work that I do is the sentiment analysis, the kind of projecting and coming up with potential close rates, things like that. That is an area that seems ripe for optimizing with AI. Are those some of the things that you were kind of talking about?
Exactly. The models right now, there's too many hallucinations for it to be considered accurate. So you basically have AI generative text. You've also got the ability to look at text. You're seeing a lot of tools, particularly in conversation intelligence, to be able to kind of replicate a lot of what you're seeing and going and driving those insights. I think that's a good use case. Basically you're creating text or reviewing text. But I'll give you an example. One of the things that we're working with some early kind of pilot customers today is around rep support. So a lot of people create ticketing for RevOps process, but no one has it. They're all adopting all of their tools, product and project managements that have literally not a feature or line written to RevOps. So you got Asana and ClickUp and Jira. That's one of a dozen tools RevOps is using that's not built for them. So if Salesforce tickets come in, if Deal Hub tickets come in, if HubSpot tickets come in, why are those not automatically creating backlog items for a roadmap? Because those platforms have no idea that those even need to happen, right? So when you think about a RevOps platform, as we're thinking about those workflows from operational support, from quotas and territories. We're thinking about those core use cases and figuring out how do we use AI to, again, reduce friction and increase velocity. Reducing friction for a lot of reps is, you have to know these things, you have to kind of be in RevOps, which is when reps submit tickets, either through Slack or through Teams or through cases, or some system, they're being resolved by the frontline managers and ICs, a RevOps person, but it's almost like a whack-a-mole. Comes in, solve it, keep them going. But then this is literally how things get brought up, which is like, hey, we've gotten this like 5 times this week. Like, wait, hang on a second, how big of is this a recurring issue, or is this a one-off use case? Well, that's a very manual thing. Teams can become faster when they understand some of the blockers happening within the company, right? If you knew that 10 of your reps are all bogged down in almost one step, but no one ever tells you, right? How do you solve for it? But if you can have systems in place where, again, leveraging the value of reading text today in AI models and kind of exploring future use cases for data analysis, that's a great way for RevOps to leverage AI today. But you're not going to get through Asana. You're not going to get through ClickUp or Jira or these other tools. They're not going to build a model specific to RevOps. They're focused on project managers, product managers. They're thinking about their integrations with. They're not thinking about RevOps. It's a small use case, but RevOps is one of the fastest growing job titles on LinkedIn, and there's a ton of people new to it, right? And so I think that's the opportunity for companies like ForwardWorks and others to think through RevOps problems, solve it with RevOps first solutions that leverages AI.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to seeing those, enter the market, because there's definitely a need. We talking about reducing friction and kind of making especially bringing in a RevOps role for the first time, or being in a RevOps role for the first time. Maybe we can talk a little bit about where RevOps sits in an organization. Like, who does RevOps report to? Who reports to RevOps? In your experience, because you've kind of been in a bunch of companies in different sizes, how does that break down?
I would say it breaks down in kind of two main phases. You get your build phase and your optimize phase, right? Your build phase, it should just sit with whoever is trying to improve the efficiencies of the company. And at the early stage or a small company, I don't think it actually matters who you report to, as long as that person is supporting you. There's the org structure is just not mature enough to matter. It's like RevOps is reporting the person that's going to help. Maybe it's the salesperson, the sales lead, marketing lead. It's just whoever cares about the details of the operation and can be your air cover. What I mean by air cover is you need somebody in the C-suite that's going to go to bat for you when you're trying to do something and prioritize it, because it's not always intuitive to everybody else why this project matters. Like, well, if we do this, we'll be 20%, we can get 20% more leads. And they're like, I don't want, like, you need somebody who can bank on the intuition of a RevOps person and understand the world of how they think about the business. So whoever that person is in the organization in the build phase. After the build phase, you need the organizational alignment that creates a separation of church and state between operations and revenue. I think there are two good options, and then there are some that create pros and cons. I don't necessarily say they're bad, but the best option is the RevOps person reports to the CEO, director level or plus. So director, VP. I don't know if there's ever going to be a C-suite for RevOps. I don't think there needs to be. That person is basically just the COO. So the CEO or the operations lead is who the RevOps person should lead to. So COO, CEO. It can report to the CRO if that CRO owns the entire go-to-market function, not just sales. I think it creates a little bit of a conflict of interest if you're calling shots for the CRO's number. I've seen that play out where that can be tough when it's like, hey, this is the correct answer. This is the correct way to do it. But the CRO is like, well, that reduces my number. Yeah. And they are now financially incentivized to choose another option.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's not just the CRO. That applies to the marketing lead, the sales, anybody who has a target and is incentivized, even if it's a bonus structure off of the outcome. The person who is the team that's responsible for calling balls and strike is now in an environment where and you may never see it because it could be a one-on-one where it's going to be like, hey, we make this call, if we change, it could literally be changing dates on something that seems small, but I've seen this play out with just the decision of, do you accept free emails in a company, right? If you got sales ops and marketing ops, the head of marketing is incentivized to create pipeline, which is volume, generally. Hopefully you have some, and then there's kind of opening up a Pandora's box on how you incentivize marketing, but point is, generally pipeline and sales is focused on closed pipeline in general. And that creates sometimes friction around how you classify a lead. What's the right stage? Is it closing? Like that, those are conflicts that come up when you have either siloed operations teams or you report to the person that owns that number. So So CEO, COO, I've seen some trends of conversations happening for chief financial officer. I think that's a bad call. That's probably one of the worst options. Again, in the build phase, not a big deal. If the CFO is going to be your air cover and has got your back, then like that works. Once you start building an organization where there's more defined roles and responsibilities, it's hard for me to see how the CFO understands things like approvals in, well, actually, he or she probably would understand approvals in Deal Hub. They may not understand the nuances of lead routing for marketing. They're too far removed. They've never experienced it in their career of why it matters to call somebody in 2 hours or 2 minutes, right? And sure, they would get it, but are they going to prioritize that over your QBR and your board deck on Monday? No, because that CFO's ass is on the seat for that board call on Monday. So guess what he has RevOps doing Thursday and Friday? They're doing data analysis. Guaranteed. You find me anybody reporting to CFO, and I stack rank their time, it's going to be data analysis and financial analysis first. The argument is if CFO owns that as a singular view of the finances. And that's fine if you view RevOps through the lens of exclusively analytics and revenue reporting. Right. But it ignores a RevOps team reporting to the CFO is not in the trenches with your demand gen marketing or helping them create leads. That is the key priority because the CFOs oftentimes think about revenue way different. That's too far off the pipeline. So again, it comes down to priority. There's too many fires going on. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't support it. It just means every RevOps team out there has got 50 things on fire and they can only do 10 this week and they can only do 3 well at best. So which 3 is it? And which 5 do they try to squeeze in and ignore the other 20? Whoever they're reporting in is just going to have a bias. Your marketing person is going to have a bias towards pipeline and branding and events attribution. We just had an event on Thursday, so I need to spend the rest of this week getting event attribution. Right? Where your customer success lead is going to be like, well, hang on a second. I've got my 5 biggest customers quarter QBR coming up the next 2 weeks. I need you to help us build these decks or build a renewal playbook. And so that's where if you report to your individual head of finance, head of sales, head of marketing, head of CS, they're going to be incentivized for RevOps to focus on that. And that's where I think anybody who reports to those teams is really just marketing ops plus, sales ops plus, CX ops plus, or finance ops plus if they report to those teams.
That was, the idea of we are basically, our actions are very much kind of dictating our, the outcome, right? Like our actions are dictated by our incentives. And I see that playing out in all sorts of wacky ways everywhere, but especially the larger a company becomes, the more it comes to play. I'd love to dive into that even further, but we're actually kind of at the end of time here. But before we sign off, Brantley, if there's anywhere that folks can go to learn more about you, about what you've done, what you're doing at ForgeWorks, or kind of the insights that you provide, why don't you tell the folks at home how they can learn more?
Great. I'm always available on LinkedIn. I love to chat with people, especially in this space, because there's so much information that's tribal knowledge. You just have to learn from other people. So I'm always learning and connecting people in the junior, senior, it doesn't matter. I just love to figure out how are you approaching it? How are you solving it? What do you find that's working today? Because the playbook has just changed that fast. So LinkedIn is the easiest way, but also communities like RevGenius and RevCoop. Those types of communities are I'm on those. I'm active on those. I think it's a great place to connect with people in this space.
Awesome. Brantley, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today and looking forward to continuing conversation maybe sometime in the future.